King S. Guard gave final shouts, "At ignorant tourist." The palace stood grand and proud, its golden gates gleaming in the sunlight as people gathered in front of it, eagerly waiting for the changing of the guard. For many, it was a dream come true, a chance to see one of the most famous ceremonies in the world, where the Queen's soldiers, dressed in their distinctive red uniforms and tall black hats, stood motionless like statues. In the midst of the crowd was a tourist, unaware of the significance of what he was about to witness. He was just one of the hundreds of people who had come to see the spectacle, but unlike the others who were content to watch from a respectful distance, he had a different idea. He had heard about the King's Guard but knew little about the rules and traditions that came with them. All he knew was that this was something people took photos of, and he was determined to get the perfect shot. As the ceremony began, the guards moved with precise, synchronized steps, their faces as stoic as the stone walls of the palace behind them. The crowd fell silent in admiration, knowing that each movement was part of a tradition that had been passed down through generations. However, the tourist was not interested in the tradition or the history behind the ceremony. He was focused on one thing: getting a good picture. Without thinking, he stepped forward, pushing his way through the crowd, completely disregarding the personal space of those around him. His camera was raised high, the lens aimed directly at the guards. He tried to maneuver into position for a perfect shot, inching closer and closer to one of the guards, who stood motionless at his post. The guard's uniform was immaculate, his posture impeccable. But the tourist, in his excitement, paid no attention to the fact that the guard's stillness was not just for show. It was a sign of respect and discipline that went back centuries. As the tourist positioned himself right in front of the guard, he reached out, almost touching the soldier's uniform to get the best angle. Some of the other tourists nearby began to murmur, sensing that something wasn't quite right. But the tourist, too caught up in his mission for the perfect photo, didn't hear them. He was only focused on his camera and the potential like he might get on social media. The guard's eyes never moved, his stance never wavered. But in that moment, he felt the uncomfortable proximity of the tourist. The King's Guard, a symbol of the monarchy's strength and dignity, was trained not to react, no matter how close or invasive the public became. It was part of their job, part of their role in maintaining order and respect in one of the most iconic locations in the world. But even the most disciplined soldiers had their limits. The tourist, oblivious to the tension growing around him, took a few more steps forward. He was determined to get the best angle possible for his picture. He clicked the shutter button on his camera several times, without realizing that he was now too close. He had crossed a line, one that many visitors to the palace didn't even know existed. There was an invisible boundary around the guards, a line of respect that should never be crossed. But this tourist had no idea. In the crowd, some people started to feel uneasy. There was an unspoken rule among tourists: you respected the guards and their space. Everyone had heard the stories, the legends of people who had tried to joke with the guards or take silly pictures, only to be met with a stern response. The guards were known for their stoic faces, for their ability to stand perfectly still, no matter the distractions around them. But the crowd knew that even they had their breaking points. At first, the tourist's actions went unnoticed by most of the crowd. But as he continued, more people began to take notice. A few elderly tourists, who had seen this ceremony many times before, exchanged knowing glances. They had witnessed this before. The ignorant tourist who didn't understand the seriousness of the occasion, the one who treated the ceremony as if it were a circus act. The atmosphere began to shift. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, but it was still just a background noise to the tourist's focus on his photo. He was unaware of the growing tension as he nudged closer to the guard, trying to get just one more shot from a different angle. The guard stood like a stone, but a slight change in his posture was enough to reveal his frustration. His hands, usually still and relaxed, tightened just slightly around the rifle he held. His jaw, which was usually set in an expression of calm, tightened just enough to indicate his discomfort. But still, he did not move. The crowd watched in silence, many feeling a sense of unease. They could tell that the situation was escalating. Some tourists felt the urge to speak up, but they didn't want to disturb the ceremony. They had come to witness a moment of British tradition, not to become part of an incident. But the discomfort was growing, and even the most composed tourists were starting to glance nervously at each other. The tourist finally took his last picture, and as he stepped back to admire his work, he felt a rush of excitement. He had done it. He had gotten the shot. He didn't realize, though, that in his quest for a perfect image, he had disregarded something far more important: respect. Respect for the tradition, respect for the soldiers who stood at attention, and respect for the space around them. The tourists around him began to shift uneasily. Some of them exchanged glances, unsure of how to handle the situation. They had come to see a performance, but they hadn't expected it to be disrupted by someone who didn't understand the gravity of the moment. The soldiers' silence seemed louder than any words could have been. As the ceremony continued, the tourist took one last look at the guard, unaware that he had just crossed a line that most people would never even think of approaching. The guard, still silent, kept his position. But in his mind, he was beginning to wonder, how much longer could he stand there, ignoring the disruption? How much longer would it take for someone to realize that there was more to this ceremony than just the surface? The quiet tension in the air hinted that things would not remain this peaceful for long. What had started as an innocent visit to the palace was beginning to unravel into something far more complicated. The atmosphere felt charged, as though something was about to happen, a shift in the energy of the crowd. And all the while the guard stood still, his face as unreadable as ever, but his mind beginning to stir with thoughts of what was to come. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace was thick with excitement and anticipation, but for all the visitors, there was an underlying feeling of tension. The changing of the guard ceremony, a tradition that had been performed for centuries, was a moment of pride for many. The guards stood tall, their black hats shining under the sun, their red uniforms bright against the backdrop of the palace's majestic walls. For some, it was a sight that captured the history and dignity of the British monarchy. For others, it was just another item on their sightseeing list. Among the crowd was the same tourist who had been snapping pictures earlier. He hadn't fully understood what he had stepped into when he pushed forward to get that perfect shot. What he didn't realize was that, for the soldiers performing the ceremony, it wasn't just a performance. It was a sacred duty, one that involved years of training, discipline, and a commitment to upholding centuries-old traditions. The tourist had unknowingly entered a world where respect and honor were paramount, something he wasn't prepared to understand. As he stood there, reviewing his photos, the crowd began to shift. Other tourists who had been watching the ceremony now glanced nervously in his direction. Some had already noticed the way the soldier's posture had stiffened when the tourist had gotten too close, but they had hoped it was just a momentary discomfort. However, as the guard's eyes remained fixed forward, his jaw set a little tighter, and his fingers seemed to flex around his weapon. It became clear that the situation was reaching a breaking point. The tourist, unaware of the effect his actions were having, took another step forward to take yet another photo. He moved slowly, as if trying to perfect his angle, but it was this very hesitation that made his next move all the more intrusive. The guard, who had been standing perfectly still, suddenly shifted his weight ever so slightly. His muscles tightened in a barely noticeable way, his back straightened even further, and his eyes, though still fixed on the distant horizon, narrowed slightly. It was as if he was silently warning the tourist that he had reached the limit. But the tourist, wrapped up in his excitement and determination to capture the perfect moment, didn't pick up on the subtle shift. He took a step closer, almost standing shoulder to shoulder with the guard, his camera now mere inches away from the soldier's uniform. The click of the camera's shutter echoed through the air, a sound that felt jarring and intrusive, considering the solemnity of the moment. The soldier's body seemed to stiffen even further, and the crowd around them began to murmur in unease. "Don't get too close," a voice whispered from the crowd, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The tourist, now feeling the rush of adrenaline from getting his photos, stood there admiring his work, oblivious to the shift in energy around him. He had no idea that the guards were not mere performers. They were symbols of something far greater than just the spectacle they provided. The soldiers were part of a long-standing tradition that demanded respect from everyone who crossed their path. And that respect, which the tourist had not shown, was something the guards would not ignore. A few other tourists, sensing the discomfort in the air, stepped back. Some even moved a few feet away from the tourist, as though distancing themselves from the situation. The murmurs grew louder as more people began to notice what was happening. Some of them even felt a sense of embarrassment for the tourist, who had no idea how close he was to crossing an invisible line, the line that separated mere curiosity from disrespect. At this point, a few more of the tourists in the crowd began to exchange uneasy glances. They were familiar with the stories of people who had been shouted at or even escorted out of the area for violating the sacred space around the guards. The soldiers were known for their unflinching discipline, but everyone also knew that if the situation escalated too far, the results could be uncomfortable. Some tourists began to wonder if this would be one of those rare moments when a guard would break character and react in a way that was not expected. One elderly couple standing a few feet away from the tourist exchanged quiet words. The woman, with a look of concern, whispered to her husband, "He's getting too close. He doesn't know what he's doing." The man, who had seen the changing of the guard on numerous occasions, nodded. "Some people just don't understand," he murmured. They both watched the guard, who had not moved a muscle, but his entire posture seemed to convey a silent message. The elderly man looked at the soldier's face, which remained as stern and unyielding as ever. But beneath that calm exterior, there was an unmistakable sense of tension. The crowd, sensing that something was about to happen, became quieter. The murmurs faded, and all attention turned to the guard and the tourist. The whole scene felt frozen in time. It was as if everyone around them was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when the tourist would realize that he had crossed a boundary that could no longer be ignored. And then it happened. The guard, who had been standing motionless for what seemed like an eternity, suddenly took a sharp, deliberate step forward. His heavy boots echoed loudly against the pavement, and his rifle shifted slightly in his hands. It was a subtle movement, but it was enough to break the stillness. The tourist, still unaware of the tension building, turned to look at the soldier. For the first time, he met the guard's eyes. The soldier's gaze was intense, unblinking, and full of authority. The tourist, finally realizing the seriousness of the situation, felt a chill run down his spine. There was no humor in the soldier's eyes, no friendliness. It was as though he had finally been pushed to the edge, and he was now silently warning the tourist to stop. The moment was a stark contrast to the light-hearted mood the tourist had been in just a few moments ago. The crowd, too, seemed to recognize the shift in the atmosphere. Some people instinctively took a step back, while others stood still, watching in silence. The tension in the air was almost tangible. No one dared to speak, and the tourist, who had been so confident before, now felt his nerves tighten. He had no idea how to react. He was caught in the middle of something that had suddenly grown far more serious than he could have ever imagined. It was clear now that the guard had had enough. His patience, normally a hallmark of his training, had reached its limit. The tourist's actions had disrupted something that was meant to be revered, and in this moment, there would be no turning back. But the tourist still hadn't fully grasped what was happening. He stared back at the soldier, as if waiting for some kind of signal or a verbal response. He didn't know that the response had already been given, a silent, unspoken warning that he had been too close for too long. The tourist stood there, still holding his camera, his eyes locked with the king's guard. For a moment, everything around him seemed to slow down. The crowds, the palace, the other guards, it all blurred into the background as he stared into the unyielding gaze of the soldier before him. He had always heard stories of the guards, of their ability to remain motionless for hours, their stoic faces never breaking into emotion. But this was different. There was something in the air now, something unspoken but unmistakable. The guard's posture had changed. The tightness in his shoulders, the slight flex of his fingers around the rifle. These were the signs that the situation had escalated beyond a simple photograph. The tourist's heart began to race as he realized that he had crossed a line. He wasn't sure exactly what he had done wrong, but the look on the soldier's face made it clear that something wasn't right. The guard had always been a figure of stoic authority, someone who had stood silent for hours through rain, snow, and crowds of tourists. But today, the soldier's patience had worn thin. For a brief moment, the tourist considered backing away. He could apologize, step back, and pretend that he hadn't been so careless. But the pride of wanting the perfect shot still gripped him. He had traveled all this way, and it had taken him forever to get this close. The crowd around him seemed to hold its breath, watching him. Some tourists were glancing at each other, perhaps wondering if they should intervene, while others had already begun to step back, sensing that this was no ordinary encounter. The guard, still unmoving, seemed to be waiting for the tourist to acknowledge what had just happened. The silence stretched out, long and heavy. The air felt thick with anticipation, but the tourist remained frozen, unable to fully comprehend what was unfolding before him. It wasn't just about a photograph anymore. It was about respect, a concept he had clearly overlooked in his pursuit of a perfect moment. And then, without warning, the guard took a single, deliberate step forward. The sharp, echoing sound of his boots hitting the stone pavement seemed to reverberate in the air. The noise was louder than it had any right to be, and it sent a ripple through the crowd. The tourists around them took another collective step back, instinctively creating more distance between themselves and the confrontation that was unfolding. For a split second, the tourist's eyes darted around, unsure of what to do. He had heard stories of guards who never spoke, who never acknowledged anyone, but this was different. The guard had moved. There was an unmistakable energy now, a shift in the air that hinted at something more than just a simple reprimand. The tourist's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. "Back off," came the sharp command, the words spoken with a clarity that cut through the growing tension. The guard's voice was firm, commanding, and carried the authority that had been simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't loud, but it was strong, echoing with the weight of the moment. The tourist, stunned, took a step back. His mind scrambled to understand the gravity of what had just happened. He had been so focused on getting the perfect picture, on capturing the moment for his social media, that he hadn't once considered the history and tradition behind the ceremony. The king's guard were not simply performers. They were symbols of the monarchy's strength, of centuries of history that were far beyond the tourist's shallow understanding. Around him, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. Some tourists stepped back in obvious discomfort, their eyes darting between the soldier and the flustered tourist. Others stood motionless, their gazes fixed on the unfolding drama. No one knew exactly what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear. The situation had gone beyond anything that could be ignored. The tourist, now realizing the magnitude of his mistake, began to feel the sting of embarrassment. He hadn't meant any harm. He had just wanted to capture the moment, but he hadn't understood the weight of what he was interfering with. His camera, still hanging around his neck, felt heavier than ever. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, and he could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The guard's eyes, cold and unblinking, never left him. The soldier stood firm, his posture impeccable, and his silence spoke volumes. For a brief moment, the tourist considered apologizing. He could say something, anything to break the tension. But what would he say? What could he say? The damage had been done. The unspoken rules of the ceremony, of the guard's sacred role, had been violated, and the soldier had done what was necessary to restore order. The tourist's throat tightened. He had thought of the changing of the guard as a simple ceremony, a piece of British tradition he had come to witness. But now he realized that there was more to it than that. This was not just a performance for the tourists. It was a living, breathing piece of history, a symbol of something much larger. And he had disrespected it, but the guard was not finished. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them, his boots sounding louder with each step. The crowd was now fully aware that this was not a simple misunderstanding. It was a breaking point. The king's guard had stood firm, silent, for so long that the slightest movement now seemed to send a shockwave through the crowd. "Move back!" The guard's voice cut through the air once more, and this time it was not just a command, it was a warning. There was no mistaking the authority in his voice. His patience, which had been stretched to its limit, was now fully spent. The tourist, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, began to retreat. His steps were hesitant, and his face flushed with a mix of confusion and embarrassment. He had never imagined that this could happen. In his mind, he had been a spectator, a casual observer of a public ceremony. But the reality was far different. The guard had drawn the line and the tourist had crossed it. Now, there was no turning back. As the tourist stepped away, the crowd began to murmur again. But this time, the whispers were filled with a mixture of admiration for the guard's professionalism and sympathy for the tourist. Some felt that the soldier had been too harsh, while others felt that the tourist had deserved what he had received. But no one could deny that something significant had just occurred. The changing of the guard, which had once seemed like a simple tourist attraction, had now become a lesson in respect and tradition. The tourist, his face still red with embarrassment, turned away from the guard and the palace, retreating into the sea of other tourists who were oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. But in that moment, he learned a valuable lesson. A moment of disrespect, no matter how small, could shake the foundation of something much larger. And as he walked away, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret. He had come to see the changing of the guard, but he would leave with a much deeper understanding of what it truly meant. The silence that followed was thick and almost suffocating. The tourist, now several steps away from the guard, turned to face the rest of the crowd, his mind racing. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but he didn't dare look back at the guard. He had already been reprimanded, and the weight of what had just transpired was still sinking in. For a moment, he considered leaving, walking away from the scene, but something held him in place. He couldn't just walk away. Not yet. As he looked around, he saw that the other tourists had begun to distance themselves from him. Some of them were talking in hushed voices, casting glances in his direction, while others simply went on with their sightseeing, their attention turning back to the ceremony. But there was no denying that the atmosphere had shifted. The initial sense of excitement and lightheartedness that had filled the air when the changing of the guard began had evaporated. Now it felt as though the crowd was holding its collective breath, waiting for something more to unfold. The guard, still standing at attention, had not moved. His posture was as rigid as it had been at the start of the ceremony, but there was something different now. His eyes, though still fixed ahead, carried a quiet strength, as if he were embodying the weight of centuries of tradition with every passing second. He had done what he needed to do. He had restored order, reminded the tourist of the respect owed to the ceremony, and reminded everyone around him of the power that silence and discipline could hold. But despite the guard's unwavering focus, there was a sense of unease that hung over the scene. The moment had been unsettling for everyone involved. The crowd had been silent for so long that it almost seemed unnatural. Even the hustle and bustle of the tourists, who had once been laughing and chatting, now felt muted, as though they too were caught in the gravity of what had just happened. For the tourist, the embarrassment was undeniable. He had always prided himself on being a well-mannered traveler, someone who respected the places he visited and understood the importance of local customs. Yet today, in his pursuit of a perfect photo, he had completely disregarded the very thing that made the changing of the guard such a revered tradition. He had treated it as if it were just another spectacle, another stop on a long list of tourist attractions. But now, standing there in the midst of the crowd, he realized just how wrong he had been. As the ceremony continued, the tourist found himself torn between wanting to leave and wanting to understand more about what had just happened. He couldn't stop thinking about the guard's eyes, the way they had locked onto his with such authority. It wasn't just the soldier's physical presence that had been imposing. It was the way he had conveyed everything in a single, unblinking stare. There had been no need for words, no need for a raised voice. The message had been clear from the start: respect the tradition or face the consequences. For the rest of the crowd, the scene had also left an impression. Many of them had been silently observing, some out of curiosity, others with a sense of discomfort. No one had expected the situation to escalate in this way. The changing of the guard was meant to be a peaceful display of tradition, a glimpse into British history and discipline. But today, it had become a reminder that even the most solemn and seemingly routine moments could be disrupted by a lack of respect. A few tourists exchanged quiet words among themselves. Some looked sympathetically at the tourist who had caused the disturbance. They had seen what had happened, and they understood that he hadn't meant any harm. But others, particularly those who had been more familiar with British traditions, couldn't help but shake their heads. They had seen this before, tourists who treated the ceremony as a photo opportunity without understanding its deeper meaning. In the midst of it all, the guard remained unwavering. He had done his duty, and now, with the tension diffused, he returned to his post with the same stoic composure that he had maintained throughout the ceremony. His movements were smooth, controlled, and almost effortless. He had not broken character for a second, and yet, in his actions, there had been a quiet power that few outside of this world could truly understand. For the tourist, the moment was still raw. He had always considered himself respectful of the places he visited, but now he realized just how easy it was to overlook the subtle lines of respect that existed in every culture, in every tradition. It was not enough to simply show up and take a photo. There was a deeper understanding required, one that demanded patience, awareness, and, most importantly, respect for the history and people behind the tradition. As the ceremony came to an end, the tourist felt a strange mix of regret and awe. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that he would not soon forget. The changing of the guard had never seemed like such an important moment to him until now. It was not just a performance. It was a living representation of a culture that had endured for centuries. And in a single moment, he had been reminded of the power of respect and the consequences of neglecting it. He turned away from the scene, walking slowly through the crowd, his mind still racing. The crowd had begun to disperse, but the echoes of the ceremony lingered in the air. The quiet, disciplined march of the guards, the solemnity of their presence, and the quiet authority they commanded, it all felt different now. It felt more real, more significant. As he walked away from Buckingham Palace, the tourist couldn't help but think about how many others had probably made the same mistake he had, treating the ceremony like just another tourist attraction, something to be photographed and moved on from. But now he understood. He understood that there was so much more to it. And even though he felt embarrassed by his actions, he also felt grateful for the lesson that had been taught to him. In the end, the moment had been more than just a lesson for him. It had been a reminder for everyone. The guards, with their silent authority, had shown not just the tourist, but the entire crowd. That respect was something that had to be earned and given freely. It wasn't just about following the rules. It was about understanding the deeper meaning behind them. And that, the tourist realized, was a lesson that went far beyond the changing of the guard. As the tourist left the scene of the changing of the guard, the events of the past moments began to settle in his mind. His feet carried him through the crowds, but his thoughts were still caught in the same tense moment he had just experienced. His mind replayed the guard's stern look, the sharp step forward, and the commanding voice that had shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the ceremony. He had come to Buckingham Palace hoping for a simple, memorable experience, but what he had learned today went far deeper than he ever expected. For the first time, he understood the full weight of tradition, the kind of tradition that was more than just history. It was living, breathing, and still very much a part of everyday life. The changing of the guard, something he had always thought of as a tourist attraction, was so much more than that. It was a sacred duty, a symbol of strength and discipline, and it was clear to him now that the guards had earned their reputation through years of unwavering commitment. As he walked through the streets of London, the busy hum of the city around him seemed to fade into the background. It was as if the world had grown quieter, and the significance of the moment had become clearer in his mind. He thought back to his earlier actions, the way he had pushed too close to the guard, the way he had treated the ceremony as just another picture to snap. But now, as the reality of the situation sank in, he could see how wrong he had been. He had taken for granted the reverence and respect that were required when interacting with such powerful symbols of a country's heritage. The guard, standing at attention in front of Buckingham Palace, was not just a soldier performing a job. He was a representation of history, discipline, and respect. And by getting too close, by ignoring the unspoken rules of conduct, the tourist had disrespected that sacred role. The embarrassment was still there, but there was also a sense of gratitude. The tourist realized that, in a way, he had been given a rare gift, a lesson in humility and respect that he could carry with him for the rest of his life. He had been given the opportunity to learn from his mistake in a way that most people never did. He would never again approach a moment of tradition or culture with the same casual disregard. He would now understand the importance of respect, of acknowledging the deeper meanings behind the symbols that people held dear. As the crowd around him began to thin, he found himself thinking about the other tourists he had seen earlier. They had been just as eager as he was to take their photos, to capture that perfect moment of the changing of the guard. But how many of them had truly understood what they were witnessing? How many had simply come for a snapshot, without giving a second thought to the ceremony's history and significance? The tourist could almost hear the whispers of the crowd as they passed by, some of them still discussing the incident. He imagined them judging him, wondering why he had acted so recklessly. But he also realized that their judgment was part of the lesson. He wasn't the first person to make such a mistake, and he wouldn't be the last. But today, he had been given a rare opportunity to learn, to grow, and to understand something that most people would overlook. Walking through the streets of London, he passed by other landmarks, each of them rich with history. Westminster Abbey, the Tower of London, Big Ben, each of these places, like Buckingham Palace, carried with them a weight of tradition and meaning. The tourist now saw them with new eyes, as places that deserved more than just a passing glance. They deserved respect. They deserved understanding. He couldn't shake the feeling that the experience at Buckingham Palace had changed something in him. Before, he had traveled to many places, snapping pictures and moving on to the next destination without much thought. But now, he saw the value in taking a moment to pause, to truly understand the significance of what he was witnessing. It wasn't about getting the perfect photo or checking off another site on a list. It was about appreciating the deeper meaning behind each place, each tradition, and each story. As he continued to walk, the weight of the moment seemed to lift. The initial embarrassment had faded, replaced by a sense of clarity. The lesson he had learned wasn't one he would forget anytime soon. He would carry it with him on every future journey, not just as a traveler, but as someone who had come to understand the true value of respect for history, for culture, and for the traditions that had been passed down through generations. Back at his hotel, the tourist found himself reflecting on the events of the day. He thought about the guard, how he had stood firm, unshaken by the tourist's disregard, how he had shown him, and everyone watching, the importance of respecting traditions. The guard's silent authority had spoken volumes, and it was something the tourist would carry with him forever. The lesson wasn't just about etiquette. It was about understanding that some moments in life deserve to be treated with reverence. Some things, once disrupted, couldn't be easily fixed. The next day, when the tourist went out again to explore London, he did so with a newfound sense of respect for the history that surrounded him. He visited more landmarks, but this time, he didn't rush to snap pictures or hurry to move on to the next attraction. Instead, he took his time, paused to read the plaques, learned about the people and events that had shaped the city, and thought about the moments that had made those places meaningful. He found himself appreciating the quiet dignity of Westminster Abbey, the imposing presence of the Tower of London, and the timeless elegance of St. Paul's Cathedral. And, in a way, the tourist knew that he had become a different kind of traveler. One who didn't just come to see the sights, but to understand them, to learn about the stories behind them, and to approach each moment with the respect it deserved. He had been taught that every place, every tradition, carried with it a deeper meaning, and that meaning deserved to be honored. In the end, the tourist left London with more than just a collection of photos. He left with a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a respectful traveler, one who saw not just with his eyes, but with his heart. And as he boarded his flight home, he knew that this experience would stay with him, a reminder that respect, no matter where you are in the world, was always the most important thing you could bring.